Good evening. I am pleased to welcome you to this event on building solidarity with struggles in Latin America. To introduce myself, I'm Sarah Woolley, BFAWU General Secretary and GFTU President. We are here today to say Trump, hands off Latin America. We are here to oppose racism and intervention and support social progress and equality. This event is supported by Arise, a festival of left ideas, and also supported by a wide range of Latin America solidarity organisations, some of which you can find out more about in the links posted in the chat throughout. Thanks also to everyone who donated online when buying their ticket to enable this event to take place. And if you haven't done so already, please consider donating during the event. All around the world, we are going through a major crisis, and the left needs to put forward ways to transform society. Part of this must be by standing with those movements, governments, and others globally standing for a better way, where public needs to come before corporate greed. That's why we're delighted to have this platform and build links with the left in Latin America, which is an inspiration. We've seen election victories in Mexico, Bolivia, Honduras, Colombia, Brazil, and more. And we've seen Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela stand up against illegal US sanctions. This event today is then about learning how the leftward shifts in certain Latin America countries have challenged the neoliberal order and US domination. But in particular, it is also to look at and alert our own movements and organisations here about the dangers posed by Trump's return to the US presidency, especially with well-known advocate of sanctions and interventions in Latin America, Marco Rubio being his Secretary of State nominee. Now, I can't wait to move on to our speakers, so I am going to move straight on because you're not here to listen to me this evening. It is a great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, joining us directly from Honduras, where big political battles for sovereignty, social progress, and putting people's needs ahead of corporate greed are very much ongoing under the Xiomara Castro-led government. Please all welcome Rodolfo Pastor, former Secretary of the Presidency in Honduras. And Rodolfo, you're very welcome.
Thank you. It's an honor to be able to be part of this collective effort to try different perspective and different way which I guess empire and imperialists are impacting Latin America. I'm apologizing because I'm actually on the road. We're traveling from the capital city of Tegucigalpa to San Pedro Sula, which is our industrial city, and that's where I'm from. And although I was Secretary of the Presidency until recently, until 5 months ago, I have since become a candidate for mayor of San Pedro Sula, and I've been able to return to this city from which I come, where I grew up, and become more closely acquainted with the harsh reality of a city that is a very prosperous city. It's a city that produces roughly 50% of our GDP. It's where our industrial, our commercial, financial hubs are, and that's actually the case because we are very close to our main port, the port of Puerto Cortes, where we export many of our main products, and San Pedro Sula. I'm actually using San Pedro Sula as a way to maybe tell you a little bit more about Honduras and the influence that the U.S. has had over Honduras for the last 150 years. Because I understand that that this is specifically about President Trump coming back to being president, which is mind-boggling in itself. But it's also important to point out that regardless of it being Trump being president or Biden being president or Obama being president, the U.S. is still the U.S. and the ways of empire are pretty much stable when it comes to how the U.S. foreign policy addresses issues in our region. And San Pedro Sula was born out of the boom that began at the beginning of the 20th century with the export of bananas. And Honduras is the emblematic banana republic. We were a country that was taken over United Fruit Company. At one point, they were the owners of roughly most of our economy. Newspapers, they definitely shaped our industrial and commercial capacity, and they were responsible for this area of the country that is located on the north coast of Honduras, and is originally a very hard tropical area where we are, exposed to a number of tropical issues, including plenty of rain and mosquitoes and mosquito-borne illnesses and diseases. It actually was developed because the banana companies came in and they first cut most of our mahogany that was exported, and they drained the swamps around the area, and they used herbicides and pesticides to protect their crops. And San Pedro Sula is actually still crossed by a rail line that goes from that part of the valley all the way to the port, to Puerto Cortes. And of course, for a lot of Hondurans and a lot of San Pedro Sulans, the banana company represented a way to access jobs and hopefully improve conditions. And yet, what happened was what happened all over the region when it came to these banana companies. And I can think of Gabriel Garcia Marquez's Cien Años de Soledad, or there's a Honduran author, Ramon Amaya Amador, who writes a very, very important literature piece called Prisión Verde, the Green Prison. And it talks about the harsh conditions of labor under the banana companies and the enclaves that these banana companies established. I guess Trump is in many ways a rasher, a more outspoken, a more rude version of the U.S. towards our region. He definitely is not concerned with being polite about what he thinks about our region, and has addressed our region, and specifically Central American countries as shithole countries from which these aliens come in and invade his land and eat the pets, the cats and the dogs. And yes, of course, that is very offensive in many ways. And yet, like I say, I believe that the hardest impact that the U.S. had in a region is the way that U.S. interests, corporate interests, have been protected and have been promoted and have been established in our countries at the cost of our human rights, of our natural resources, and of course of our democratic institutions. And we were very powerfully reminded about that back in 2009 when we thought we had overcome the reality of coups in Latin America and in Honduras, and yet a coup happened, and a coup was able to succeed and left behind a government that was increasingly corrupt and repressive, and was staunchly a U.S. ally. both at a local, regional, and international level, and whose president, whose authoritarian president, President Juan Orlando Hernandez, was in many ways boosted and kept in power by U.S. interests, even if we all knew, and of course U.S. diplomats knew, that he was highly corrupt. He had active links with organized crime, and he is now serving a sentence for those crimes, the ones that he committed against the U.S., not the ones he committed against Honduras, in a prison cell in New York City. It was the Southern District of New York Attorney General's office that was able to get enough proof that this guy was linked to crimes committed against the U.S., drug trafficking mostly, and they were the ones. It was the Department of Justice in the U.S. That was able to subject him to some sort of justice. Here in Honduras, during 12 years that he was in one way or another in charge, there was nothing to be done. He was in charge of all institutions, and he controlled justice, and he controlled the police, and he controlled the attorney generals, and so he was completely able to get away with anything. And he had the backing of the U.S. And so the coup happened when President Obama was in power, and then Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. But then Trump came by, and Trump was a big fan of Juan Orlando Hernandez, as long as he was committed to controlling the influx of immigrants towards the U.S. and very, very ironically, I say this, also controlling the flow of drugs towards the U.S. And both of these are rather ironic because, of course, the regime that he led, the corruption and the repression that he was responsible for, obviously also provoked immigration towards the U.S. And we could see that immigration from Honduras to the U.S. peaked during his government. And at the same time, this is a guy who's being kept in power by the U.S., praised by President Trump, and yet he is being responsible for trafficking tons of cocaine to the U.S. He's being praised as an ally, as a strong ally of the U.S. So I think when we think about the impact that a future Trump presidency can have on Honduras, it's very clear to me that not a lot will change. Of course, thinking about Marco Rubio becoming the next Secretary of State is also surprising to many of us. Just the fact that someone like Marco Rubio could be Secretary of State in the U.S. and that he represents so much of what we struggle with. Him being a Cuban American who has a very hard line on any Latin American country that is trying to become more independent and become more autonomous. So yes, I foresee maybe some different connotations, but the presence of the U.S. in Honduras is like I say also quite stable. Mining interests, of course. We have agricultural imports. Honduras is a country that exports huge amounts of food, especially palm oil, at the expense of also being a country that suffers from hunger. 2 million Hondurans suffer from hunger in a country of 10 million because the lands that should be producing corn and beans for Hondurans, like they've been producing for the last millennia, are now producing African palms or palm oil for the U.S. and international industry in general. So you see, there's a a very formidable challenge when a country and a society faces these powerful interests that are able to control the way that democracies develop or regress in many ways. And I am hopeful that Honduras is moving forward in the right direction. And certainly the fact that President Xiomara, the first woman to be elected president in Honduras, is setting a way forward towards more independent development. We are still subjected to US imperialism, and we will be subjected to a very close relationship with the US because we are right underneath the talons of the eagle, and we will be for the foreseeable future. And even if the US might be a declining superpower, it's still going to be very powerful, and it still will have an enormous influence on our region and in our country.
Thank you so much. That was brilliant. I learned an awful lot just from that contribution, and the fact that you've managed to squeeze us in whilst travelling in the car is we're even more thankful that you could spare the time. And just before I bring Sian in, I just thought it might be a good idea to read this comment that was put in the Q&As whilst you were still here. So it's from Calvin Tucker from the Morning Star. And he says, I reported from inside Honduras during the 2009 military coup, and the slogan of the resistance was, they are scared of us because we are not scared of them. The then Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, sold Honduras down the river when she signed off the coup. It was a historic day. Despite all sorts of manipulation and dirty tricks, and he ends by saying Viva Honduras, and I'm sure we all echo that. Thank you so much for joining us and for that great contribution, and safe travels wherever it is you're heading to.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. We will move swiftly on, and the amazing Sian is going to join us to put an appeal forward for a rise. So Sian, come on in.
Oh, thank you so much for that, Sarah. I am here, people, to implore you to help us cover the costs of this meeting. You will all be familiar now with how we regularly have people popping up and asking this of you. But I just think it's so fantastic also that the last contribution from Rodolfo showed that, like, the fantastic benefits of having these remote meetings, particularly on international topics where people can, listen in from all around the world and contribute from all around the world, and while people are on the move and running between things because we're all busy activists and doing things. So it's fantastic to be able to have these online meetings, to leave them on the YouTube so that people can see them later, to have them as a resource. But as I've said before, just because we're not in a physical space altogether, these sort of digital infrastructure still costs money. So those of you that can afford it, we know that lots of people can't, but those of you who can, if you could please contribute and click on the donate link, it would be hugely appreciated, because it also means that solidarity events like this can continue to be free for all. So those of you that can afford it, please click on and just donate while you listen to the remaining of our speakers, and it would be hugely appreciated. And I will now let you get back to hearing from all the wonderful speakers we've got coming up. Thank you.
Thanks, Sian. Thanks ever so much. Our next speaker is from the belly of the beast, the USA itself. It's a great pleasure. I did see him earlier, so I'm hoping he's still on the call. It's a great pleasure to welcome back Alex Main, Director of International Policy at the Centre for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C. Alex, you are very welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Sarah, and it's a pleasure to be back with you all, and a really special pleasure to be sharing the stage with my old friend Rodolfo, who I got to know after the coup in 2009. The coup brought us together. The resistance to the coup that took place brought us together here in Washington, D.C., where he was representing the democratic government of Honduras in exile in extremely difficult conditions. So great to see Rodolfo again. It was wonderful to hear him, and I wish him, the best of luck with his candidacy to San Pedro Sula. And so, yeah, I'm here in the belly of the beast, as you said, Sarah, and at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, where I'm the director of international policy. You can find a lot of materials on Latin America, and particularly the role of the U.S., about the impact of U.S. imperialism in Latin America and the Caribbean on our website at cepr.net. But I've been asked to talk about Trump and Latin America. Well, here we are again. Another Trump presidency. And as Rodolfo said, it is quite mind-boggling. But that tells you a lot about the US, really, that we've ended up with Trump once again. And, last time around, there were some people trying to find a silver lining and noting that, some of Trump's advisors and so on were sort of isolationists in their perspectives, or seemed to be. And there was a hope of a break with the old traditions of liberal imperialism and the more recent neoconservative tradition in the U.S. Two versions of imperialism that have treated Latin America in particular pretty terribly. But what we ended up getting, and this is where I differ a little bit with Rodolfo, I think was actually worse than the Obama administration, despite the many horrors, including the Obama administration's support for the coup in Honduras in 2009. So just as a quick rundown of some of the record of Trump in his last administration, which I think can tell us a bit about what to expect going forward. The first thing that wasn't such a great sign was that you had various senior officials, including Trump himself, that sort of proudly bragged about reviving the Monroe Doctrine. And for those that aren't aware, the Monroe Doctrine is this 200-year-old policy that officially opposes the interference of foreign powers in Western Hemisphere and Latin America, but in practice has been used to justify all sorts of nefarious U.S. interference in the region. And so Trump and his team proudly bragged that the Monroe Doctrine was back, because rhetorically, at least, the Obama administration had shelved the Monroe Doctrine, even though they did actually continue to practice the Monroe Doctrine. And yeah, in practice, the Trump team, did faithfully adhere to the Monroe Doctrine and supported overt military coups, a successful one, of course, in Bolivia in 2019, something that our research center did a lot of work on, and then a failed one in Venezuela that same year, and did an enormous amount of harm through its use of U.S. economic sanctions. It adopted some very hard-hitting sanctions against Venezuela, on Cuba, which had gotten a small measure of relief from sanctions under Obama. Trump hardened the sanctions and broadened them really to an unprecedented level. And they're now at a level that we've never seen, really, since the blockade against Cuba began. And then Trump's team really invigorated this Cold War policy that's targeting the supposed threat of China and its influence in the region, which provides, again, a pretext for more intervention, more militarization in Latin America. And Trump, through sheer example, has boosted the far right all over Latin America. And there are some far right figures in various governments, and has tightened relations with a number of far right movements. And they're really conspiring together against progressive movements in the region. And so I think that's sort of a very unique and particularly sinister threat coming from this incoming Trump administration. As we know, when Biden came in, he mostly maintained Trump's worst policy, certainly all of these sanctions, which he largely kept in place, and that have, really suffocated Venezuela and Cuba and caused devastating economic crises in both these countries, huge waves of migration. In the last couple of years, over 1 million Cubans have left Cuba. That's about 10% of the population. That's according to the Cuban government's own numbers. It's an exodus that Cuba has never in its history experienced. So now Trump is back. And so what can we expect? How much worse can it possibly get for Latin America? And, his foreign policy team, the way it's shaping up, gives us perhaps an idea of how it could look. And you have really some of the most militantly interventionist, militaristic, anti-leftist people around in Washington, D.C., starting with, as Rodolfo mentioned, Senator Marco Rubio from Florida, who's a hawk across the board, but particularly on Latin America. At the State Department, he will most likely have a very close comrade of his, another Cuban American, Carlos Trujillo, who will be running the Latin American division of the State Department and who played a very instrumental role in Bolivia's military coup in 2019 when he was at the Organization of American States. At the White House, Trump's national security advisor is going to be a complete neocon and former Green Beret, Mike Waltz, who's currently in the House of Representatives, where he's been leading legislation that hardens sanctions against Venezuela and Cuba. And I could go on and on with this list. We haven't mentioned Elon Musk yet, who has his own twisted agenda and has ties also to the far right in Latin America. We can certainly expect, I think, a more direct and aggressive intervention against the progressive movements in the region and in favor of neo-fascist movements. There's already a very clear far-right pro-Trump axis that's developed with the very enthusiastic support of Javier Milei's far-right sort of pseudo-libertarian government in Argentina and Brazil's neo-fascist Bolsonaro and Bolsonaro's family. And I think there's a huge threat of really major US interference in several regional elections that are coming up next year, where progressive movements have been in power in Ecuador, in Honduras, in Chile, in Bolivia. And in all these countries, you have far-right candidates that are aligned with Trump and that are coordinating with Trump's team. And then independently of elections, other countries, and particularly those where the US military has deep ties, could see more US-backed coups. That's a real threat. In Brazil, all of this evidence has emerged of the very deep involvement of senior Brazilian military officials in a coup attempt in 2022 to try to keep Bolsonaro in power after he lost the last election. So those sort of coup-mongering elements have deeply infiltrated the Brazilian military. In Colombia, the country's first left-wing president, Gustavo Petro, is under constant attack from the right-wing elites, and Trump and his entourage have extremely close ties with former right-wing President Uribe and his allies. Uribe, as you may know, is an absolutely rabid anti-leftist who played a central role in Colombia's right-wing paramilitary groups, was responsible for enormous atrocities against civilians while he was president. And then Honduras, of course, you have this major military presence in the country that's been there since, I think, since the late 70s, at least since the 80s. And we saw the military coup in 2009 under Obama. There's certainly a risk of something like that happening again, where there's deep opposition in DC already to the progressive government of Xiomara Castro. And in Mexico, you know, Republicans have already been threatening U.S. military attacks as part of the U.S. drug war, and the left has just won re-election in a landslide, and that's a fact that doesn't sit well at all with the U.S. foreign policy establishment, let alone with the Republicans. And Trump has just named an ambassador there. His name is Ronald Johnson, and he's a former special operations combatant who was active in El Salvador in the 80s alongside the death squads, and then became a senior CIA official. Need I say more? So really, some serious threats of coups, and under Trump, we can expect sanctions against left governments in the region, as well as tariffs, which Trump, you know, it seems to be weaponizing against adversaries. We can expect that to also get worse. But, you know, I think interestingly, Trump's going to run into a big issue. I mean, one that is already huge, which is that his sanctions have triggered massive waves of migration, particularly from Cuba and Venezuela. And yet, you know, one of the central planks of his nativist electoral platform was resolving the so-called migration crisis by kicking millions of migrants out and keeping them out. And one of the reasons that Biden lost or rather Harris lost the election was the surge in migrants arriving from Latin America, in particular Venezuela and Cuba. I mean, here in the US, we have our own Murdoch press, and they and the rest of the media depicted these migrants as a threat to the US, even though they've been a boon to the US economy. And of course, Trump made the migrant threat his threat, quote unquote, his number one campaign issue. So then you have, you know, so you have military coups, US-backed far-right governments who support neoliberal agendas that create economic misery. That's going to be another factor driving more migration, as it has been for many years now. And so I think this is maybe one of the best ways, certainly from here in Washington, to denounce Trump's past and future policies in Latin America. They're forcing more Latin Americans to flee their homes and head for the US. Trump's Latin America policy is fueling migration. And then finally, you know, I know Arise has been deeply in solidarity with Cuba. I think a major priority needs to be Cuba in this next administration. I mean, right now, where the situation is really increasingly desperate for ordinary Cubans, due, you know, in large part to these additional sanctions that Trump has imposed. And I think, you know, those in the UK in solidarity with Cuba and Latin America more generally should really urge the government as best you can. I know it has a lot of issues, but to raise this issue at every opportunity. And in particular, I mean, you know, obviously the blockade needs to be removed entirely, but where the US president can start without any congressional action is removing the state sponsor of terrorism designation, which is causing massive human suffering. Among other things, this designation, it's a major obstacle to UK residents and residents from Europe and Japan and Australia and many other countries that visit Cuba. It you know, results in, when folks from the UK, none of you may want to go to the US, but there are a lot of visitors of the UK to the US, and if they go to Cuba, their ESTA, which allows them to go to the US, is removed. And then they have to reapply for a formal visa to the US. It's a massive headache. So this is creating a huge obstacle to tourism. It's led to a massive downturn in tourism, which Cuba increasingly relies on for its income. It's the second biggest source of income for Cuba at the moment. And there's just absolutely no possible justification for keeping Cuba on this list. And so really the UK needs to join the EU and be far more forceful than the EU, and join, you know, many Latin American countries in denouncing this SSOT, state sponsor of terrorism designation, as well as, of course, the blockade more generally. And I think my time is well up, so I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex, for that. I'm so glad you didn't go on about Elon Musk. We see enough of him on X. We don't need to hear about him anymore. But thank you for giving the outline of the situation and the picture. I think, you know, much like with Rudolph, I learned so much from that, and it's so vitally important that we hear from people directly in the thick of things rather than just relying on what we see on or not see on, as the case may be, mainstream media over here and news channels. So thank you for taking the time out and joining us, and for that contribution. We were going to hear from Claudia Turbet-Delof, a great friend of all the groups organising today's event next, who is an organiser in the Brazilian community here and internationally. However, Claudia has been attending a funeral today, so has had to send her apologies for this evening, and I know you'll join me in sending condolences to Claudia. Just before I bring our next speaker in, we've got people joining us from all over this evening, from West Yorkshire, North London, Manchester, Chelmsford, Norwich, Loxheath, and even as far away as Norway and Mexico. So it is truly an international event this evening, and not only from a speaker point of view. I will move swiftly on to our next speaker, who is Bernard Regan from the Cuba Solidarity Campaign. Bernard, you are more than welcome.
Thank you, Sarah. I was listening closely to what Alex had to say and busily crossing out things that I'd written down that I was going to comment on. So hopefully I will try not to be too repetitive with what he said. But just to begin, in 1960, under the President Eisenhower's rule of office, a man called Lawrence DeWitt Mallory wrote a document in which he said basically that the only way to get rid of Castro was to create disenchantment and dissatisfaction by applying economic penalties on Cuba. And in all essence, that has not changed since those very first days of the Cuban Revolution of 1959. In other words, there's been a continuous policy by all United States administrations. And although there's been slight variations between Democrats and Republicans, in essence, the strategic objective of the United States administrations has been to bring about the downfall of the Cuban Revolution. And that was true even with Obama, who is widely viewed as kind of having the most liberal approach towards Cuba, establishing diplomatic relations and beginning some sort of processes of normalization, but nevertheless did not bring about any fundamental changes. So it's clear that in the last 4 years, for example, of President Biden, that you could not put a cigarette paper between the Democrats and the Republicans in terms of their policies. When Trump left office, in the very last days of his term of office in January 2021, he introduced something like 243 additional measures and designated Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism. And Biden did nothing to remove that and has never removed it, never changed a scintilla of the policies that Trump implemented in terms of attitude towards Cuba, nothing of any great significance, and that is continuing. So in essence, we're starting from essentially Trump Mark 1. Trump Mark 2 will be just a continuation of that, and Biden will not have affected that, or there will not be anything significant that will have to be changed by Trump Mark 2 from what has happened over the last 4 years. And it's an extremely vicious blockade. I mean, most people know about it or have heard about it, but Cuba has lost in the region of $164 trillion over the last 60 years. And Cuba is a developing poor country. It's not a destitute country. You don't see homelessness. You don't see rank poverty on the streets. I was in Cuba just a matter of 3 weeks ago. You don't see that kind of poverty that you see in places in the West, but you do see a relative poverty. So it's clearly a major problem. And Cuba has to import something like 80% of its foodstuffs. Over the last few years, of course, it suffered very strongly as a result of COVID, and that hit tourism in a very major way. So that foreign incomes, foreign revenue stream, if you like, was limited over that last period. But in addition to not having the capacity because of the state-sponsored terrorism categorization that Trump imposed on Cuba, it makes it very difficult for Cuba to use normal international mechanisms for transferring money, for buying things, for gaining credit on the international market. And companies which do business with Cuba, if they have any business in the United States of America, they're extremely cautious about engaging in activities that have Cuba related to it. The French bank Paribas, for example, was fined $9 million just a few years ago for actually transferring money to Cuba as one of its activities. And even in Britain, if you try to set up a GoFundMe page to raise money, for example, as my union, the National Education Union, has done to buy Braille machines for schools for the visually impaired and blind children in Cuba, there's a difficulty there because they won't, if it mentions the word Cuba in the title or references Cuba in any way, then it's very likely that it will be blocked, it will be prevented. So I think we are in for a sharp situation vis-a-vis the coming period of the Trump administration. And I'm not particularly optimistic, although I agree with Alex that we have to put pressure on the British government. But given Starmer's attitude towards the events that are taking place in Palestine, I'm not convinced that there's going to be a great deviation, even from the Trump administration's political policies internationally, from what there was in relation to Starmer's attitude towards Biden, for example. So I think it is a difficult period that we're heading for and a real challenge that is on the horizon. Rubio, of course, will be the Secretary of State, the equivalent of the Foreign Secretary in Britain, a man who, you know, has manufactured a background in order to give himself some credibility. He claims that his parents fled Cuba. In fact, they left Cuba in 1958 before the revolution actually happened. So in all truth, they were actually fleeing from Batista rather than from what happened with the Cuban Revolution in 1959. But nonetheless, we know his track record in relation to politics in the United States of America and the attitude that he will have. So I hope that people will engage in solidarity action. I think it's a major challenge for all of us in respect of Latin America as a whole. I think we have to make a real effort to put internationalism on the agenda of the trade union movement, of the political parties, and to challenge the complicity of Britain in terms of what is happening not only in the Middle East, but to challenge its acquiescence to the policies that Biden and Trump have been pursuing vis-a-vis Latin America, and from my perspective, particularly in relation to Cuba.
Thank you ever so much, Bernard. And do you know what? How disgraceful is it that you can't set up a GoFundMe page to raise money for what is a good cause? It's a great cause. It shouldn't need to be done, but it is having to be done. And not being able to do that, well, it's disgusting, isn't it? There's no other word for it. But thank you for that contribution. I'm going to move swiftly on because we've got 2 speakers left. And I want to make sure they've got plenty of time and plenty of you are still here to listen to them. So our next speaker is Maria Perez Ramos, who's going to talk to us, well, she's from Mexico, talking to us about the gains in social progress that have been made there in recent years and the threats now posed by Trump's return, including, you know, around anti-migrant xenophobia. So Maria, you are very welcome.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me and for having me here. I am now speaking on behalf of the Mexico Solidarity Forum. Just to, in case you don't know much about Mexico, because it's something that happens on this side of the world. This is the second time we have a leftist government in office. This time, the winner was a woman from Jewish descent from Europe, which is quite impressive due to the like fame of like machismo in Latin America and Mexico in particular. So some of the changes that have happened thanks to these new governments from the Party Morena, which is a movement party founded by the previous president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, are like transitions. He started to make a transition from neoliberalism to a more normal capitalism, let's say. So he started new social programs, having people in the center of the focus of everything. Some of these programs have become now constitutional, and one example of those ones are the pensions for elderly people that are universal, and now they are a right. He also started different programs that have the environment in, as the center, like the one that is like Planting Life, which is promoting food self-sufficiency and also reforestation across the country, and is being brought throughout Latin America as well. There are other programs helping women, indigenous people, and different types of workers across the region, well, in Mexico. And at the moment, another thing that I'm very proud of that this government helped realizing or coming with is that we now have an embassy of Palestine in Mexico. And also another thing that I'm very proud of is that Mexico in like with Chile were the first two countries that denounced the war crimes of Israel, although the crimes committed by Hamas as well on October the 7th before the ICC, not only the ICG. And that is something that doesn't sound around like very often, but I think that it is worth mentioning. At the moment, we are the current president, Claudia, she started with very big promises of new programs taking into account the environment, cleaning water, continuing with new policies to restrict the exploitation of the resources, especially water, because of the lack of this resource that we are having. There's a scarcity in several areas. So now moving to Trump and Alex, and I think also Bernard already mentioned most of the things that I wanted to focus on, that were these policies that are threatening us. But specifically, the one that I want to focus on, that is the one that worries me the most beyond the, racist rhetoric around the immigrants and the mass deportation and sending every single migrant to Mexico because they are illegal, although they are just undocumented. The main problem for me, as I said, is the problem of the violence and the new narrative that Trump is propagating. That is that he is typifying the cartels as terrorist organizations to find an excuse to invade Mexico and start with an operation, switching the war against drugs to a war against terrorism. Although all these practices that the cartels are carrying out don't count as exact terrorism as it comes in the dictionary, because they are not following any type of ideology, or they are not trying to gain any political power. As we know, cartels are working more like corporations. They just care about profiteering and then stuff like that. So yeah, there is this very worrying thing, because the right-wing leaders in Mexico, and also the corporate media that is basically paid by them, have been cheering up all of these things that Trump is saying, and they are justifying it, and they are even asking for it. So it is very important for us in Mexico that you support us and speak about it, and I mean, don't speak about Cuba and everything. And I think that it is very good that we stand in solidarity together, because we are a region that share a common, not only language, but like cultures and history. And we've been suffering a lot from US imperialism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria, and absolutely echo your point. It is important that we talk about it. It is important that we pass the message on to others so that people know the truth of what's going on, not what we're hearing. And I've said that a couple of times this evening, but we can't stress it enough. And that's why evenings and events like this are just so important, so that we can get that message out. And people, even if they can't watch it right this very minute live, can come back and see and hear what's going on. I'm going to move on to our final speaker of this evening, Latin America expert, our representative on the panel today of the Venezuela Solidarity Campaign, plus Nicaragua Solidarity Action Group, and good friend Francisco Dominguez, who's going to update us on the growing efforts from the US for a legal regime change in Venezuela, new sanctions on Nicaragua, and more besides. And I just hope you've warmed up slightly now, Francisco.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah. A great deal of ground has been covered, but we want to understand what Trump will have to do regarding Latin America rather than what he's planning to do. Because there are these imperatives that imperialism has in the region, which I'll come back to in a second. So the very fact that Trump appointed Marco Rubio as his state secretary is a clear indication of what he intends to do. Marco Rubio has been instrumental with a bunch of other extreme right-wingers in the Republican Party, intending to destroy the Cuban Revolution, the Venezuelan Revolution, and any other progressive government that may emerge in the region. And we Latin Americans, that's what I mean, we have the bad destiny of cohabiting, in our continent with the most powerful military machine in the history of humanity. So therefore, what they have done already, I think the Biden administration, in preparation for preparing the ground for Trump or Nicaragua, is accusing Nicaragua of weaponizing, this is the term they're using, weaponizing migration, so that loads of people, hundreds of thousands, hundreds and hundreds of thousands, there's a huge amount of exaggeration in the media particularly. This was done by an NGO, a think tank called Inter-American Dialogue. What they wanted to do was it was they who actually produced this narrative. And the consequence of this weaponization of migration on the part of the Nicaraguan government, as the United States claims, is complicating the life of the United States, because this allows hundreds of thousands, if not more, people to go to the United States and illegally immigrating into that country, which Trump and company do not want at all. I watched and I followed the election in the United States almost daily for months. And the level of the degree of demonization against illegal immigrants was unbelievable. One town in Ohio famously became notorious because Trump said that the Haitian immigrants, people from Haiti, went around the place eating the people's pets, cats and dogs, and then ducks, and then geese. And he said, Trump himself said this, in the debate with Kamala Harris. So using this narrative, the United States has punished the Nicaraguan government by imposing sanctions on 250 members of the Nicaraguan government and 3 key entities. All of them will have an economic ramification. The idea is to punish the country. And on this charge, so this is in preparation set for what is coming. I won't say more on Nicaragua, but there is an article which has been put on the chat, which was written by John Perry, a Nicaraguan expert, a British friend, who actually lives in Nicaragua, where he denounces all of this in the Morning Star in an excellent article he's written with great amount of details. So let me then turn to the question of Trump. He didn't win a landslide, but he did win. The difference in votes in percentage terms, between Kamala Harris and him was 1.5%. Trump got something like 77 million in the last count, which is 99% of the votes counted. And Kamala Harris got nearly 75 million. So the difference between them is 1.5%. So it wasn't a landslide. Nevertheless, he won the presidency, and it was his sub-brand of the Republican Party that wasn't dominant. He won the House of Representatives, a majority, and he won the Senate. And on top of that, he has the Supreme Court completely on his side. The Supreme Court of the United States is a very key institution whenever you want to do something, whatever it is, in US politics itself. And a majority of them are extreme right-wingers, Christian nationalists at best, much worse at worst, if you see what I mean. So he has control now over the Foreign Affairs committees of both the House of Representatives and of the Senate. So therefore, these are even more powerful institutions that dictate policy. When these institutions, because they're run by the majority party in the Congress or in the Senate, when they produce a policy, almost nobody opposes it within the institutions. When it comes to Latin America, imagine no House of Representative member, congressman or congresswoman, or senator are going to oppose this because they will label Chavistas, communists, or worse. So therefore, he's got all the mechanisms that he wants in order to really attack. Now, his imperative is to, so that I think he's going to follow SOUTHCOM, the Southern Command of the United States, which is the military body in charge of us, the Western Hemisphere, from the Pentagon side. And what they have identified as a key strategic problem is the influence that China particularly, but also Russia, are getting in the region. Bless you. They are getting in the region. So the influence they're getting is because they're trying to cooperate with the Latin American countries on, on all sorts of areas. China is involved in infrastructure projects everywhere. China is the main trading partner of most of Latin America. The Latin Americans are trading in huge amounts with China. They're getting investment, technology, markets, and credit, which is, it's a very good deal. The Chinese are not threatening at all. The chances that China sends a fleet to invade any country in Latin America is huge. And even if they were, I think any Latin American country would oppose it. And the United States is there, right there. So this is not, despite the huge amount of demonization. So Laura Richardson in particular, now that is somebody else in charge, she was a general. She was doing the running, saying that this was the key problem. What it means is this, it seems to me, is that the United States politically needs to ensure that it's able to compete or exclude these rivals using any means necessary. And we know what they do. Sanctions, coup d'etat, assassinations, and so on. The difficulty or the worrying sign is the fact that Southcom is doing the running of this. That is to say, the United States is militarizing this particular foreign policy, and Trump is going to impose it with everything he has. Just to give you one example of this, I just learned, a few days ago, by reading some of the newspapers in Brazil, that there was, following the coup attempt in 2022 that Alex was talking about, there was recently an assassination attempt on Lula, organized by Bolsonaro. This is public, by also in which also participated the Bolsonarista president of the central bank, who is really sabotaging economic policy massively. The interest rate that he set, because the bank in Brazil is independent, is at the moment 12.5%. So the government finds it impossible to do really much. He's involved in this assassination attempt. Several generals are also involved, and a few other characters. So the fact that was discovered is an indication of what techniques they're prepared to do. So finally, on the question of Venezuela, because Venezuela is the cherry in the pie. I don't know what the expression is, but I think that's the one. And mainly because politically it will be Cuba, but economically it will be Venezuela because of the amount of oil that it has. So the United States will absolutely do everything to get that price, as it were. What you see, I think they're going to intensify massively the sanctions and the aggression against Venezuela. Venezuela is in a much better position now to defend itself because it's recovered economically. It doesn't depend on oil as much as possible. Nevertheless, there is a problem with the extreme right-wing opposition, which will be supported by Rubio and company. And it is Maria Corina Machado and the people who lost the last election. Over the last period, what we have seen is a spate of terrorist attacks, attacking everything. Electricity is the main target. And there have been attempts to bring in huge amount of weapons from the Colombian side by paramilitaries and operators of the extreme right wing, people who have been trained militarily. And the intention is obviously to cause havoc. There is a worry that everybody has, which is on the 10th of December, the defeated candidate, Edmundo Gonzalez, has been saying publicly all the time, and it's been echoing some sections of the European Parliament, and certainly in the United States to some degree, but certainly the media, where he says he's going to Venezuela. He's living in Spain now because he escaped there. He's coming to Venezuela to proclaim himself the president of the country. And what that means is that on that occasion, the right wing must be preparing something interesting. Let me put it that way. The one thing which is calming for me anyway is the fact that the extreme right wing have been trying to organize several stunts over the last period. And they've got something like 50 to 100 people in every mobilization. What it means is that their political defeat has been so crushing that people don't want to know anymore. So this is the context. So it's extremely important to understand that where any of our governments in Latin America, any of the progressive governments in Latin America make a mistake of being weak or, thinking for one moment that they're not going to attack them or whatever. The United States under Trump with Marco Rubio and company will use that to the tilt. So it is absolutely vital that we intensify, redouble our solidarity efforts collectively as we are doing in this particular occasion. So if it hasn't been said, people should join the Venezuela Solidarity Campaign. It's not the best campaign, but it's one of the best anyway. But also any other campaign of solidarity with Latin America, because we need that period that is coming is going to be very difficult. We cannot trust the current British government to behave in any way whatsoever. We cannot trust any of the Europeans to behave. We can only trust in the rest of the geopolitical context, which in more than one degree is favorable. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you ever so much, Francisco, for that overview. And you're absolutely right. If you are watching this, get yourself signed up to be supporters of the different Latin American campaigns. Get your branches and the unions, get motions passed at both of those local branch AGMs and trade union conferences to get them supporting too and affiliating, because it is the only way that we're going to show actual solidarity. Francisco's right, we can't rely on our government to do this. We've got to do it ourselves, and international solidarity is the way that we drive change. That was the last of our speakers. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Thank you to the volunteers who helped put this event on, and to our fantastic speakers that have covered so much in such a relatively short amount of time. We know the left movements in Latin America have important battles ahead, and events like this are so vitally important so that we can hear, as I've mentioned a few times tonight, the reality of the situation firsthand. Please do get involved with campaigns on the issues we've discussed today and show your support by donating at the links that have been provided in the chat. We've got to keep working together to not only argue for that a better world is possible, but to win that better world. And a key part of that, a vital part of that, is solidarity with progressive forces in Latin America who are set to face renewed threats and attacks from Trump on his return to presidency. Good night. Speak soon. Viva la Solidaridad.